what I was going to say is this brings us to the narrative that all we needed to do was give Japan assurances that the emperor would remain on the throne, and they would have capitulated, right? This has been said, but we wouldn't throw them that bone that we ended up throwing, MacArthur ended up throwing them in victory. So is there any truth to this rumor?
You know, this gets back again to that point I made about the declassification of intelligence, also the diplomatic decodes. You have to bear in mind, as I pointed out, this Ketsugo thing, there was no room for any diplomacy in that until after the counter-invasion battle. No room at all for that. And the militarists saw no need to even talk about terms until they figured out what the terrain looks like after the counter-invasion battle. So they were no effort whatsoever. The emperor finally gets really nervous in June and tries to jumpstart some sort of diplomatic effort. Now, actually, the inner cabinet, which was called the Big Six, as I mentioned, this was a body of 6 individuals: the prime minister, the foreign minister, the army minister, the navy minister, and the chiefs of staff of the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy. This was the real locus of power in Japan. But here was another part of the problem. Of those 6 individuals, only the foreign minister, Togo, was a civilian. Every single other member of the Big Six was a current or prior serving, very senior flag officer of the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy. Right? Moreover, under the strictures in which they operated, the Big Six could only approve a policy by unanimity. And this is Japanese consensus culture in spades, or whatever here. So you have to get a 6-0 vote from the Big Six to get anything done, like, for instance, surrender, whatever here. And you got 5 of those votes are locked in for people who are admirals or generals. And the only civilian is Togo, the foreign minister. So now when the emperor says, I'd like to see some effort made, Togo steps in, who is the only one of the Big Six who has this sense of urgency. Japan needs to end the war, meaning surrender as soon as possible. So what does he do? He looks around and he decides, since the militarists would not countenance to the slightest degree any direct approach to the US, he comes up with this scheme of trying to recruit the Soviet Union, which is not yet in the war with Japan, to act as a mediator, to conduct negotiations, to bring about a negotiated end to the war. The conduit for doing that is the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, a fellow named Sato. He's a former foreign minister. He's a very sophisticated participant in Japanese higher level policies, even though he's not a decider in 1945. So Togo goes to Sato with this approach. And we have the exchange in detail about what goes on. And as I phrase it, Sato acts like the prosecuting attorney for the Truman administration on the futility and flecklessness of Japanese diplomacy. The first thing Sato says, well, wait a minute, we just had an imperial conference where the policy was we will fight on to the end with no thought of surrender. Who has authorized this approach? And Togo has to sort of mumble behind his hands the directing power. And Sato's sophisticated enough to realize this probably is the Big Six. So then Sato says, okay, if we're going to recruit the Soviet Union, we're going to have to provide some inducement, some trade, something tangible that those very realistic Soviet leaders are going to want to have in order to act as a mediator. And so Togo sends him this flowery language. And Sato says, basically, these are pretty little words devoid of all connection with reality. I mean, Sato's in Moscow, by the way, where assassins are not lurking against him, so he can be as open. And that's Togo's way also at this point. So then Togo comes back and says, okay, if this is going to be at all a realistic effort that's going to impress the Soviets as realistic, we have to present the Soviets with terms. You have to give us terms. Well, of course, the Big Six is never going to set out any terms. The only occasion, according to the Navy Minister, Yone, the only occasion the Big Six even attempted to talk about terms ended abruptly when the War Minister, Anami, said, I'll only talk about terms on the presumption that Japan had not lost the war. And then we come to the most critical point, which is Sato, in totally frustrated, realizing that this whole effort is just ludicrous. It's going nowhere. It's ludicrous or whatever. He sends a message back saying, look, the best Japan can hope for at this point is unconditional surrender, modified only to the extent that the imperial institution is maintained. So there, from Sato, is a version of this. If we'd only done this, we'd only done that, Japan would have surrendered. And what does Togo reply? He replies, in the name of the government. And he says, absolutely not. Absolutely not. No unconditional surrender. He doesn't even say, oh, by the way, some promise about the imperial institution would be a step in the right direction. And the people who are doing the little news summary, the magic diplomatic summary, they understand fully the supreme importance of this exchange. And they write it up. You can almost imagine like they're doing squat jumps saying, this is very important. This is very important. This is very important, telling Truman. So Truman knows, and other policymakers know that, hey, these people aren't going to move. So then we get along to the fact that we have domestic pressure in the US to at least go through some effort to see if we can get a diplomatic end. And this results in what's called the Potsdam Declaration, issued on the 26th of July. And this basically is to Japan. And it's interesting because it essentially sets out a non-negotiable terms. And the Germans got no terms whatsoever. They signed unconditionally. There was no guarantee whatsoever about anything that we weren't going to do to them. Now the Japanese are being given a set of terms, non-negotiable, but they're terms, whatever here, about this. And it promises that ordinary Japanese are not going to be punished, and they're going to return home, and all of the leadership is going to be held accountable or whatever here. And it also says, after an occupation and after Japan we're satisfied that it's been democratized and demilitarized, whatever, then the form of government Japan will have will be chosen by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. Right? This is in keeping with the Atlantic Charter. Now, you'll notice that language does not say, oh, by the way, you can't have Hirohito. Oh, by the way, you can't have the imperial family. That's all. It's not barred or whatever here. So that goes out. It gets to Japan, and what happens? Well, when it gets to the Big Six, we tend to think of them as being divided into a peace faction and a hardliner faction based on what happens a few days later. Mm-hmm. Well, when two of the three members of the peace faction, the prime minister and the navy minister, they look at Potsdam Declaration and they say, aha, here, before even the first drop of blood is shed in the invasion battle, the Americans are already wilting. They're already conceding terms before we've even had the invasion battle. And both the prime minister and the navy minister say this reinforces the idea that we're on the right path with Ketsugo, whatever here. Now you can imagine what the hardliners are thinking about seeing. I mean, this is a fantasy that if you cast out these terms, that the type of people who are leading Japan are not going to look at that and say, oh, by the way, this is a sign of exactly what we're counting on, the weakening will of the Americans. And that's exactly how they see it. It's the notion that giving that promise is a one-way ratchet towards peace is just totally fantasy.